mean by hosting? Because there's a couple of things that this could potentially mean. Well, at the end of the day, hosting is nothing more than storing a website, an application, some data on a server or a computer so that it can be accessed through the internet. But for our purposes, we want to look at two specific versions of hosting. One, hosting traditional applications that don't have cloud or web-based versions. So things like a Sage 50, like a QuickBooks, like a just older line of business applications, maybe an Act CRM or some additional application that has a desktop client that you use, but you want to use it remotely when you're on a business trip or when you're working from home. And so you spin up a server in Azure, install it there, and access it through that server. The second scenario we want to look at is at hosting web applications. And this could mean something like a Sage 300, a Dynamics GP, or other CRM applications that do have a web-based interface. And so when you install them in the server, you don't necessarily have to connect to that server directly to access them. You can access the applications through a browser. And these two scenarios open up two interesting possibilities, because I could, one, deploy these on physical servers that I manage. And this is known as infrastructure as a service. I deploy a server and I'm responsible for the operating system on that server, for keeping it patched, for ensuring its security is configured optimally. I'm also responsible for all the applications I install on that server. However, the web-based applications open the possibility for platform as a service. And these are services where I'm not necessarily responsible for the actual servers the application is running on. There may be some security configurations I can do, but for the most part, Microsoft will handle patching. Microsoft will handle security. I only have to handle the actual application that I've installed on those servers. So how do these two scenarios help our organizations? Well, first of all, remote access. One thing the pandemic has shown us is that we may need to be able to access these services from outside of the office. And so deploying these tools on the cloud can allow me to do just that. In fact, if I already have some sort of synchronization between my on-premise identity and cloud identity, whether it be that Azure Active Directory synchronization or actually running a domain controller on the cloud, I can then use my same user accounts that are on-premise and everything is already configured for them to also secure the access to these cloud resources. However, a second and very interesting bit could be to be able to scale as needed. And this could have two very big implications. Number one, it could have a cost-saving implication. And number two, it could have a performance and productivity implication. Because maybe I am an accounting firm, and during tax season, I hire additional representatives, and that server where my tax package runs gets hit really hard, and the application gets sluggish and it's slow. Well, one thing that we could do in the cloud is automatically deploy rules so that these applications scale when I have a spike in usage. And so the application doesn't become sluggish because I deploy a bigger server or more servers to run it. And so I can continue using my application without hampering my employees' productivity. This, of course, also works in the opposite direction. And so if I have a period of very, very low usage, my application can scale down and ensure that the services aren't being sitting there without being used, right? And then I'm not being billed for unused capacity. So what would these scenarios cost? Well, we've discussed two different scenarios, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. So let's have a look at both. First, let's talk infrastructure as a service. And of course, there's a lot of variability here. Depends on what application we're hosting. But let's consider an application that requires two separate servers to run. So this is a hefty application. Maybe there's a database server and an application server. And so for that database server, I'll have to run not just my Windows server license, but also a SQL server license. And maybe in this case, because we're a small business, we can make do with the SQL Server Web Edition. We're not going to get into a licensing session, but it has some limitations, but maybe it's enough for me. And then I have a app server, which is the front end of the application, and maybe I need that to be a little bit more powerful. And so I also need to ensure that I have bandwidth because of the data that I'm going to be pulling down from Azure. And I also add some backup to ensure that that database, that application is protected. Well, running such an application in the cloud, a medium-sized application, could potentially run me around $400 a month. Now, interestingly, this can actually be lower if I look at platform as a service, because that first line where I had a dedicated capacity, a fixed server size for my database server, I can replace that with something like Azure SQL, where my database can automatically scale up or down based on usage. It can even pause the database if an application is not being used, maybe a line of business application during the weekend when my employees aren't necessarily working. And so that immediately means savings for me in that first line. I can also run my front end of the application in a very similar manner. And of course, we can also take a look at bandwidth. Now, you may not see backup here. That's because it's built into these two services and into those two costs. And so that could save me around $50 a month. Now, for deploying an application to Azure, the actual implementation may vary. We may be looking at 2 weeks to a month, but it's a relatively fast way to deploy these applications. And as we'll see a little bit later, it's still relatively cheap, and in most cases may make sense to actually deploy the application this way rather than to actually keep it on premise. Now, we say most cases because, again, the goal of these sessions and the goal of the group that I lead is to help you understand, well, is it really cheaper? Is it really faster? Is it really better to run this application in the cloud or to run it on premise? Sometimes the answer is going to be yes, but sometimes the answer is going to be no.